Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're descending into the deepest shadows of Vatican City, to a place most visitors will never see. Beneath the marble floors, past the locked archives and the catacombs, lies a vault where light itself seems to hesitate. And inside it rests a book that, for centuries, has been kept from the world. Not because it is false, but because it may be far too true. This isn't a story of dusty pages and harmless legends. It's a journey through whispers, disappearances, and a past that refuses to stay buried. Some say the book remembers things we've been made to forget. Others believe it can change the person who dares to read it. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing the constellation we create. Scattered across the night, there are places in the Vatican where daylight has never reached. Tourists move through the marble halls above, dazzled by gold ceilings and Renaissance frescoes, while far below them, silence clings to the air like dust on stone. Beneath the apostolic archive, past the catacombs, and through a corridor without windows, there is a locked vault whose construction predates the library itself. Some records suggest it was first sealed in the late 1400s during the pontificate of Sixtus IV, who founded the Vatican Library in 1475. But architectural surveys reveal that the foundation stones are older still, carved in a style resembling Roman-era masonry. Inside this vault lies an object spoken of only in fragments, a black-bound manuscript unlike any recorded in official catalogs. It is not kept for study, nor for preservation, but for containment. Those few who have seen it claim its pages seem untouched by time. The ink does not fade, the leather does not crack. When Pope Paul V ordered the expansion of the Vatican Library in the early 1600s, he also signed edicts tightening access to certain works deemed theologically dangerous. Though no inventory lists this manuscript by name, a few classified documents from the period refer to an untranslated text of pre-Christian origin, stored in what archivists called the lower reliquary. To this day, the vault remains sealed, guarded not by ornate keys or ceremonial locks, but by simple iron doors that appear unremarkable until you realize there is no handle on the outside. The Vatican's official stance is that no such book exists, and yet whispers persist. Not because people have seen it, but because they have been told so firmly that they must never ask. In the spring of 1934, Cairo's souks were crowded with travelers, scholars, and those who traded in rarities that could never be openly sold. Amid the stalls of brass lamps and papyrus scrolls, a small, unmarked shop stood in a side street known to antiquarians. It was here that a European collector named Adrien Duval claimed to have acquired a book unlike anything he had seen in his years searching for rare manuscripts. Duval's own notes, recovered decades later in a Paris estate sale, described the binding as black leather with a sheen like oil on water, which seemed to ripple when caught by lamplight. He recorded that the seller refused to give a name, calling himself only the keeper and insisting on payment in gold coin rather than Egyptian pounds. There were no witnesses, no receipts. Duval left Cairo with the book wrapped in plain cloth, bound for his flat near the Nile. Within days of his return, neighbors reported a change in him. He kept his shutters closed, worked only by candlelight, and refused visitors. One colleague later wrote that Duval had mentioned seeing symbols in the book that looked like hieroglyphs but were somehow older, less rigid, as though the lines themselves were alive. A week later, he vanished. His apartment was found undisturbed, with no sign of forced entry. On the desk, a single candle had burned down to a pool of wax. The manuscript was gone. Contemporary police reports from Cairo make no mention of the case, though French consular records confirm Duval's unexplained disappearance. Whether the Vatican acquired the manuscript at this stage remains unproven, but archival patterns suggest it would not have gone unnoticed by their agents operating in Egypt at the time. When rare manuscripts of uncertain origin appear, they do not always vanish by chance. Since the early 17th century, there have been quiet accounts of a Vatican-sanctioned retrieval team operating without official title or uniform. By the late 19th century, Jesuit correspondence refers obliquely to our men in the field, specialists trained in languages, antiquities, and the discreet removal of problematic texts. Publicly, such a group does not exist, yet evidence of their work surfaces in the gaps of historical records, sudden closures of excavation sites, unexplained acquisitions by private collections that later reappear in Rome, and customs logs showing diplomatic crates that bypass inspection. According to a retired archivist who spoke anonymously in the 1980s, these retrievals are prioritized when a manuscript is considered a threat to theological stability. The phrasing suggests the issue is not heresy in the familiar sense, but something that might undermine the chronological or doctrinal framework on which church teaching rests. If Adrien Duval's manuscript matched descriptions of pre-Christian, non-biblical cosmology, it would have been exactly the sort of item this team sought. In Vatican records from 1934, there is a single coded entry noting the arrival of a sealed package from Alexandria that same summer, labeled only as Source Unlisted for Deep Reserve. No dimensions, no description. The delivery date falls within 2 weeks of Duval's disappearance. While the contents are officially unknown, the correlation is difficult to ignore. Those familiar with the retrieval team's methods say they leave no trace, no legal claim, no acknowledgement of the object's existence. Once inside Vatican walls, the manuscript would have been transferred directly to a lower vault, bypassing the main library's accession process entirely. From that point on, it would be as though it had never been found at all. Beneath the Vatican Library, itself founded in 1475 by Pope Sixtus IV, there are older foundations whose exact origins are undocumented. Archaeological surveys of the site, when permitted, show masonry techniques consistent with late Roman construction, suggesting parts of the substructure predate the Christianization of Rome in the 4th century. These deeper chambers are not part of the publicly acknowledged secret archives, which were renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive in 2019. Instead, they exist in a separate security category, known internally as sub-reliquary, a term that appears only in restricted inventories. Access is tightly limited, often requiring both a senior archivist and a cleric of rank to be present, each holding a separate key. Contemporary accounts from those few allowed inside describe an atmosphere unlike any other archive room. The air is cool and dry, the walls bare of decoration, the lighting minimal. Shelving is sparse, with each object or text stored in its own locked container. The room itself is protected by a set of plain iron doors with no visible handles, opened from within after a coded knock. When a manuscript is deemed too volatile to remain even in the secret archives, it is placed here. Documents from the 17th century mention the transfer of an unclassified volume of extreme antiquity to such a sub-reliquary following grave concern among the learned. While the identity of that volume is unknown, the wording parallels later references to a black-bound manuscript whose content was never described in public records. If Duval's book followed this path after arriving in Rome in 1934, it would now rest in that vault, unseen by any but a handful of archivists whose duty is not to study it, but to ensure it is never opened again. Those who claim to have briefly seen the black-bound manuscript agree on one detail above all others. It does not reflect light. The leather cover, described as darker than obsidian, appears to absorb illumination from nearby sources, leaving the edges of the book in soft shadow, even when placed under a bright lamp. Inks used on parchment typically fade over centuries, a process accelerated by exposure to air and light. Yet witnesses say the lettering within remains sharp and unweathered, as though it were written yesterday. The pages themselves are unusually smooth, lacking the slight texture of calfskin or vellum. One Jesuit scholar in the 1950s reportedly noted in a private letter that the sheets were cool to the touch regardless of the season and gave off a faint metallic scent, like rain on stone. There is no verified explanation for these qualities. Speculation ranges from the use of rare resins in the binding process to the possibility that the materials are not of terrestrial origin, though such claims have never been substantiated. The earliest reliable mention of similar bookmaking techniques comes from late antiquity, when certain ceremonial texts in Egypt were sealed with mineral-based pigments to deter tampering. The black-bound manuscript, however, seems to employ a craft unknown to either ancient or medieval sources. That uniqueness has led some researchers to conclude that its purpose was never archival but functional, designed to contain the text's content in a way that alters how it is perceived by the reader. If true, then the binding is not just a cover, but an active part of the manuscript's nature, shaping the experience before a single word is read. Whether this was an intentional safeguard or something far stranger remains unanswered. When examined under controlled conditions, the manuscript's writing defies conventional classification. Linguists who have glimpsed it through official Vatican channels describe symbols that at first resemble Egyptian hieroglyphs but reveal structural inconsistencies when compared to documented Old Kingdom inscriptions. Some characters appear to merge traits from unrelated writing systems. A few carry curves and flourishes reminiscent of early Greek scripts from the 8th century BCE, while others echo the wedge-shaped impressions of Sumerian cuneiform dating back over 4,000 years. There is no evidence in the archaeological record of these scripts ever coexisting. Yet in the manuscript, they are interwoven into a single, continuous form of writing. One scholar in the 1970s attempted a comparative analysis using known proto-writing examples such as the Vincha symbols of the Balkans, dated between 5,500 and 4,500 BCE. His notes, now locked in the Apostolic Archive, suggest that while the shapes are superficially similar, their composition follows no pattern consistent with proto-writing or pictographic evolution. Moreover, the ink seems to alter in tone under different light sources. By daylight, the script appears a deep brown-black, while under candlelight, it shifts toward a dark violet hue. Under certain wavelengths, Vatican technicians observed faint halos around specific characters, as if the pigment reacts to particular frequencies. The practical implications of this are unknown, but the phenomenon has been recorded more than once. These irregularities make traditional translation impossible. If a language evolves naturally, it leaves behind a trail of intermediate forms and related dialects. This manuscript offers no such trail. It exists in a linguistic isolation, as though it emerged fully formed without ancestors, unconnected to any cultural or historical context we can trace. This absence alone is enough to unsettle those who have tried to decode it. The first serious attempt to translate the manuscript occurred in the late 1940s, when the Vatican discreetly enlisted a young philologist named Carlo Ventresca. Educated at the Sapienza University of Rome and fluent in Latin, Greek, and classical Hebrew, Ventresca also had a rare familiarity with extinct dialects of Coptic and Aramaic. He was given no explanation of the book's origin, only that its contents were considered doctrinally sensitive, and that his work was to remain confidential. The initial weeks passed without incident. Ventresca made careful sketches of the symbols and began grouping them into what he believed were syntactic patterns. By the third week, his notes shifted from academic analysis to increasingly disjointed entries. He wrote of recurring dreams in which stone corridors narrowed into blackness, and of voices speaking words he could not place but somehow understood. Colleagues later recalled that he stopped eating regular meals and often worked by candlelight even in the day. On the 23rd day of his study, Ventresca was found in his quarters murmuring phrases in a language unrecognizable to his peers. A linguist brought in from the Pontifical Biblical Institute identified some words as related to pre-dynastic Egyptian, but with altered consonants and vowel forms not present in any surviving text. Ventresca himself had no memory of speaking them and, after a brief period of rest, requested that the translation project be terminated. His notes were collected, sealed, and placed in a separate archive room. No one has publicly acknowledged what they contained. In internal correspondence from 1950, an archivist warned that the manuscript engages the reader in return, a statement which, stripped of metaphor, implies that the act of reading may in some way change the reader before any translation is complete. Among the most unsettling testimonies from those permitted near the manuscript is the claim that it does not simply sit inert on the table, but seems aware of its reader. A Dominican scholar in the 1960s reported a sensation of being watched, describing it as an intelligent attention, neither benevolent nor hostile, but present. He noted that as he read, the characters appeared to shift subtly, their lines thickening or thinning as though in response to his focus. This phenomenon was not recorded on camera. Yet, multiple independent witnesses from different decades have made similar observations. Some describe the ink as reorganizing itself into new forms when the reader's mind drifted, almost as if the text adapted to their unspoken thoughts. There is no known technology in antiquity that could account for such effects, and no modern analysis has revealed micromechanical alterations in the pigment. It remains unclear whether the changes are objective or perceptual, perhaps induced by patterns in the writing that influence visual processing. Comparable accounts exist in the study of certain medieval grimoires, where scribes warned that the pages would speak differently to each reader. In those cases, the shifting content was explained as divine or infernal intervention. Here, in the Vatican's most guarded vault, no such theological label has been officially applied. Instead, the few who have experienced it avoid speculation, noting only that prolonged exposure to the manuscript induces a sense of disconnection from time. Readers have reported glancing up to find hours passed in what felt like minutes. Whether this is an effect of the text itself or the mental state it produces remains an open question. But in an institution defined by precision and tradition, such unpredictability is reason enough to restrict the book's presence to the lowest depths. Close study of the manuscript reveals that its margins, far from being decorative or empty, contain an entirely separate layer of information. These narrow spaces between main text and page edge are filled with intricate diagrams drawn with a finer hand than the primary script. Some resemble astronomical charts, yet the configurations do not match the night skies of any known historical period. When astronomers attempted to align them with recorded celestial maps, the closest matches came from simulations of the Earth's sky tens of thousands of years in the past or far into the future, well beyond the span of human civilization as we understand it. Other marginal drawings depict architectural structures that no archaeological record has confirmed temples with impossible geometry, colonnades rising into curves that could not stand under their own weight by conventional engineering. These images are accompanied by sequences of small symbols not found in the main body of the text. In some cases, the marginalia form continuous loops around the page, as though enclosing the primary writing within a visual seal. This recalls certain manuscript traditions in which margins contain protective spells or instructions intended only for the scribe or initiated reader. However, the detail here surpasses anything in known medieval or ancient work. When reproductions of individual margin symbols were shown to independent experts in archaeoastronomy, several noted similarities to petroglyphs found in disparate locations, such as Australia's Burrup Peninsula and the caves of Lascaux in France, both dating to prehistoric times. No credible link exists between those cultures, making such parallels deeply puzzling. Whether the margins hold coded commentary on the main text or serve as a separate guide entirely, their presence complicates the notion that the manuscript was meant for straightforward reading. Over time, those granted access to the manuscript have not only struggled with its content, but in some cases vanished altogether. Archival security logs from the 1950s and 1960s note several researchers who began work on restricted holdings and failed to return their materials. These entries contain no follow-up reports, only the term clearance closed. The most documented case is that of Dr. Blings. Heinrich Bauer, a German linguist brought in during 1962 to consult on the text's unusual syntax. Bauer's letters to a colleague in Munich survive in private hands, describing his excitement at being chosen for the project. The tone changes abruptly in later correspondence, with cryptic remarks about the manuscript, knowing where it belongs, and pages that seem to remember the last person who touched them. According to Vatican employment records, Bauer ceased all contact after his third week in Rome. He did not return home, and no missing persons report appears in Italian or German police archives. His personal effects, including passport and luggage, were left in his Vatican-provided quarters. Internal memos suggest that similar disappearances were handled quietly, often explained as voluntary resignations. A handful of secondary witnesses claimed these individuals had begun exhibiting erratic behavior in the days before they vanished, walking the corridors at night, muttering to themselves, or spending long hours in prayer, despite having no particular religious devotion. The common thread was the time each had spent with the manuscript. In every instance, their last logged activity involved extended reading sessions in the lower vault without direct supervision. Whether they left of their own accord, were removed, or suffered some other fate remains unknown. But the pattern is one that archivists acknowledge only behind closed doors. It was during the mid-1970s that a researcher named Father Lorenzo Guidi noticed something peculiar about the manuscript's layout. Unlike most codices, which maintain a consistent alignment of text, this volume's lines varied subtly in spacing and margin width. Out of curiosity, Guidi began tracing the position of each block of writing, then overlaying these tracings onto transparent sheets. When layered in sequence, the positions formed a faint but discernible pattern, a map. At first glance, it resembled no geographical chart known to him. The shapes did not match any continent, and the proportions defied terrestrial scaling. Yet when he shared his findings with an astronomer at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the response was immediate. The astronomer recognized the outlines as a temporal sequence rather than a spatial one, akin to plotting the occurrence of events rather than places. Each landmass corresponded to a documented moment of abrupt cultural change. The sudden collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE, the burning of the Library of Alexandria in the 1st century BCE, the unexplained desertion of the ancestral Puebloan cliff dwellings in the late 13th century, even events from the modern era, such as the 1908 Tunguska explosion, appeared to be marked. The implication was that the manuscript contained a map of disruptions across human history, encoded through page positioning rather than the written language itself. How the book could reference events both before and after its presumed creation was a question no one could answer. Guidi's work was halted after only a few weeks, his overlays confiscated and filed under special reserve. In later years, when pressed, he would only say that the book knew when to be read and that his role had been to notice what others had overlooked. In 1981, an archaeological survey in Egypt's western desert led to the rediscovery of a collapsed Coptic monastery long buried beneath shifting sands. Preliminary dating placed the visible remains in the 6th century CE, but ground-penetrating radar revealed a deeper chamber sealed by massive stone slabs. This lower level was unlike any Coptic architecture on record. The walls bore symbols incised with extraordinary precision, their style bearing no resemblance to Christian iconography. Instead, they matched in uncanny detail certain figures found in the Vatican manuscript's margins. Photographs taken by the lead surveyor, Dr. Nabil Farouk, show star-like patterns arranged in concentric spirals and elongated figures positioned as though in mid-motion. The chamber's only entrance had been deliberately filled with rubble and plaster, suggesting intentional concealment rather than simple collapse. Among the debris were small fragments of blackened parchment, brittle to the touch, each marked with traces of ink similar in composition to ancient carbon-based pigments. News of the find was limited to a brief academic bulletin before access to the site was suddenly restricted. Officially, the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities cited concerns over structural instability and theft prevention. Yet within a fortnight, members of the excavation team reported the quiet arrival of foreign clerics in plain dress, accompanied by two individuals fluent in both Italian and Latin. These visitors remained for less than 3 days, after which the chamber was resealed and the project classified. Local workers later whispered that the visitors had removed a single chest, no larger than a travel trunk, its contents hidden from sight. No further excavation has been recorded at the site, and Dr. Farouk's later publications make no mention of the subterranean chamber. Those who compared his photographs to archival sketches of the manuscript's imagery found the resemblance too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Accounts from the monastery site speak of more than the recovered chest. A junior archaeologist, interviewed anonymously years later, claimed that before the foreign visitors arrived, the team had documented several objects sealed within the chamber. Chief among them was a mirror-like disc, blacker than obsidian, set into a bronze frame worked with spiral motifs. When light struck its surface, it did not reflect, but seemed to swallow the illumination entirely. Beside it lay a staff carved from a single piece of stone, its length etched with patterns resembling those on the manuscript's margin diagrams. Wrapped in layers of deteriorated linen were brittle scrolls. Unlike typical papyrus or parchment, their texture described as almost glass-like. Even through the wrappings, some swore they could hear a faint, continuous hum, though no recording equipment detected it. The scrolls were written in the same hybrid script found in the Vatican volume, though the characters were arranged in circular sequences rather than linear rows. This unusual format is consistent with certain ritual texts from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia that were intended to be read aloud while turning the document slowly, as if to mirror the passage of celestial bodies. The archaeologist insisted that before the chamber was cleared, these artifacts had been photographed in situ, yet none of these images appeared in the official report, and no record of them exists in Egypt's public archives. Rumors among local workers suggested that all objects from the chamber were loaded into the chest later removed by the visiting clerics. If true, it would mean the Vatican not only recovered the manuscript's counterpart artifacts, but potentially reunited items that had been separated for centuries, perhaps intentionally hidden from each other until that day. Witnesses present at the excavation site recalled that the arrival of the Vatican contingent was swift and without ceremony. The plain-clothed clerics spoke little to the archaeologists and declined to answer questions, instead directing their attention to the sealed chamber. Local security personnel were instructed to keep all non-essential workers away from the area, and the only sounds reported during the 2-day operation were the scraping of stone and the muted echo of voices speaking in Latin. The chest that emerged was bound with leather straps and bore no visible markings, yet its weight required 4 men to carry it. Those watching from a distance noted that the chest was not placed in any vehicle for transport, but was carried on foot to a covered wagon parked beyond the dig's perimeter. The wagon departed before dawn, escorted by 2 unmarked jeeps that took a route leading away from the nearest military checkpoint. Egyptian officials later confirmed in private that no customs declaration was filed for any artifacts from the site, an irregularity that should have drawn immediate scrutiny. Within 48 hours, the chamber was resealed with new stonework, erasing all traces of its recent opening. Official statements framed the closure as a protective measure to prevent looting, yet no guards were stationed afterward, and no further research permits had been granted for the location. Several members of the original team later reported receiving letters warning them against discussing the chamber or its contents, citing unspecified legal consequences. Whether these warnings were issued by the Egyptian authorities or by other entities remains uncertain. For those who had seen even fragments of the artifacts, the sense was clear. Whatever had been removed from that chamber was now beyond reach, likely joining the manuscript in the deepest vaults beneath Vatican City. In the controlled environment of the Vatican's lower vaults, archivists observed a curious property of the manuscript's writing. Under midday light streaming through the narrow ventilation shafts, the script appeared consistent and fixed. Yet when viewed by candlelight, certain characters seemed to lengthen or alter their curves, creating new forms without disturbing the surrounding text. Moonlight, filtered through the iron grates above, produced an even stranger effect. Faint lines invisible in other conditions emerged, linking separate words into what appeared to be diagrams or constellations. This phenomenon was first noted in a classified 1942 report and has been quietly confirmed by later observers. Chemical analysis of the ink has proven inconclusive, revealing only a carbon-based compound with trace minerals not typically used in historical pigments. These minerals include rare earth elements such as yttrium and samarium, which are not documented in the ink-making traditions of either the ancient Mediterranean or medieval Europe. Similar shifting qualities are mentioned in certain early Egyptian funerary texts, where inscriptions were said to awaken under specific light, guiding the soul through the afterlife. However, no extant artifact from that period matches the manuscript's level of transformation. Some archivists have speculated that the changes may represent different layers of meaning, accessible only under particular natural conditions, a method of concealment, ensuring that the full message could never be read all at once. The deliberate use of lunar light is especially intriguing, as lunar calendars played a central role in both ancient temple rites and early Christian liturgy. If the manuscript's shifting forms are intentional, then its creator possessed knowledge spanning cultures and epochs, and crafted a text meant to be read not just in space, but in time. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. By the late 1980s, the Vatican had become increasingly cautious about who was permitted near the manuscript. Access was restricted not only by rank, but also by what was termed resonance profiling, an internal process that evaluated a person's previous exposure to sensitive texts and artifacts. This measure was introduced after a troubling incident involving a visiting historian from the University of Leuven. The historian, an expert in medieval mysticism, had been invited to consult on marginalia, symbols believed to resemble certain alchemical diagrams from the 15th century. According to internal memos, within hours of beginning his work, he became visibly agitated, insisting that he recognized the symbols from dreams he had experienced since childhood. These dreams, he claimed, always ended with a sensation of being pulled backward through a dark tunnel. Witnesses said he began sketching furiously on scrap paper, reproducing not only the manuscript symbols but also new ones not found in its pages. His session was halted, and the sketches were confiscated. Later, In a private debrief, he revealed that he had no conscious memory of ever encountering such symbols before, yet felt they were instructions rather than mere writing. Psychological evaluation found no history of hallucination or mental illness. Within a week, he had returned to Belgium, declining further contact. This event strengthened the belief among some archivists that the manuscript's contents might trigger dormant memories or latent patterns in the mind, perhaps even across generations. If true, it would suggest that the book is not simply a record of the past, but a tool capable of interacting with the subconscious in ways neither fully understood nor easily controlled. The idea that a manuscript could interact with human memory is not without precedent in certain ancient traditions. In Mesopotamia, ritual texts known as namshu were believed to awaken inherited knowledge within specific bloodlines, and some Egyptian temple carvings were said to speak to initiates who had been ritually prepared. The black-bound manuscript's behavior, however, appears to operate without ceremony or preparation, engaging directly with any reader who meets its unknown criteria. Vatican incident logs from 1992 describe a case in which a young archivist, assisting only in the cleaning and cataloging of storage cabinets near the lower vault, reported vivid recollections of landscapes he had never visited. These visions included coastlines with structures of cyclopean stone, lit by a sun that seemed larger in the sky than our own. The archivist could sketch these in remarkable detail, producing maps that later drew comparisons to speculative reconstructions of the prehistoric supercontinent Gondwana. He had no formal training in geography or archaeology, yet his drawings included accurate proportions for landmasses not visible in their current continental positions. After 3 days of persistent visions, he was reassigned to duties far from the restricted areas. This event was noted internally as a secondary resonance, implying that mere proximity to the manuscript might be enough to activate certain responses. The possibility that the book could serve as a catalyst for unlocking nonverbal, inherited memory, unsettled, even seasoned archivists. Such an ability, if genuine, would explain the Vatican's determination to keep it inaccessible to all but the most controlled circumstances. It would also raise questions about whether its purpose was ever meant for reading in the conventional sense, or if the text's true function lies in what it makes the mind recall on its own. In early 2001, an incident occurred that briefly disrupted the strict control surrounding the manuscript. A visiting conservator from Florence, assigned to inspect environmental conditions in the lower vaults, inadvertently entered the chamber where the book was kept. Her report, later sealed, described the manuscript as resting on a low wooden stand draped in dark cloth. She claimed that upon seeing it, she felt an immediate and overwhelming sense of recognition, though she had never studied anything similar. Without touching the book, she noticed faint sounds, not voices, but a rhythmic pulse like distant waves breaking against rock. This perception lasted only seconds before a senior archivist intervened and escorted her from the room. Later medical evaluation found no abnormalities in hearing or cardiovascular function. What makes her account remarkable is that she had, for years, been researching a series of fresco fragments from a 14th century Tuscan monastery. These fragments depicted circular symbols closely matching several found in the manuscript's margins. The monastery records mention that the imagery was copied from a volume of dark origin brought to Italy by an unnamed cleric in the late medieval period. The conservator's familiarity with those symbols may have heightened her sensitivity to the manuscript's presence, though whether the sensation she experienced was psychological or something more remains unresolved. The incident prompted the Vatican to implement new physical barriers around the vault, ensuring that even those with legitimate work in the area could not approach the manuscript without multiple layers of authorization. Yet the fact that her reaction occurred without direct contact reinforced the concern that the book's influence was not limited to active reading, but could radiate outward, touching those with certain kinds of prior exposure. The connection between the manuscript and medieval Italy is hinted at in several obscure sources. A marginal note in a 15th century Latin psalter, preserved in the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, refers cryptically to the Black Book of the Roman bishop, which sleeps under guard. This line is followed by a warning that its words are not for the tongue, but for the marrow. The psalter's owner, a Dominican friar named Matteo di Rossi, was known for his work copying forbidden theological tracts before their destruction. His surviving correspondence includes a letter to a fellow friar in Venice in which he describes a journey to Rome in 1478 and being shown a codex whose script dances in the candle's breath. While the authenticity of this account is debated, the timeline coincides with the papacy of Sixtus IV, under whom the Vatican Library was formally established. If the manuscript was already in Rome by that year, it must have been acquired decades, perhaps centuries, before its official storage in the sub-reliquary. This would undermine theories that it entered Vatican possession only in the 20th century after Duval's disappearance. The fact that multiple medieval references describe similar visual properties, shifting script, a sense of physical vitality in the text suggests a continuity of experience across time and culture. Whether Matteo's description was based on first-hand observation or on hearsay passed among cloistered scholars cannot be definitively proven. Yet, if genuine, his words indicate that the book's mystique was well established long before modern efforts to classify or contain it. This raises another unsettling possibility, that its guardianship has not been the exclusive domain of the Vatican, but part of a longer, perhaps older, tradition of keeping the manuscript hidden from the wider world. Hints of a pre-Vatican custodianship emerge in certain Byzantine sources. A 10th century Greek chronicle housed in the monastery of St. Pastry. Catherine on Sinai describes a book without a shadow, kept in the imperial treasury of Constantinople. The chronicler, identified only as Michael the Deacon, recounts that the volume was brought from the southern deserts by a monk returning from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. According to his account, the emperor ordered it placed in a sealed chest of cypress wood to be opened only on the feast of the Annunciation. When the chest was eventually unlocked decades later, the text inside was said to have been unchanged by time, the pages as bright and unblemished as the day was bound. The description of the script, characters unknown to the Greeks, as if carved by the stars themselves, bears a striking resemblance to modern testimonies regarding the Vatican manuscript. The fate of the book after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople was sacked by Western forces, is unknown. Many treasures of the Byzantine court were looted, sold, or absorbed into church collections across Europe. It is plausible that the manuscript could have entered papal hands during this period, particularly given the known transfer of relics and illuminated codices to Rome in the aftermath. If so, it would have passed through centuries of upheaval before disappearing into the Vatican's most secret vaults. This possibility challenges the idea of a single, continuous guardianship and instead suggests a lineage of custodians, each inheriting the responsibility and the danger of keeping the book from the public eye. Such a lineage, stretching from Byzantium to modern Rome, may be the missing link in the manuscript's fragmented history. The possibility of a custodial lineage becomes more compelling when considering scattered references from the Crusader states. A fragmentary account from 1229, preserved in a Genoese merchant's diary, describes a Latin cleric in Acre who claimed to possess the desert book which whispers in the night. The merchant, Marco de Falco, recorded that the cleric refused to show the book, but spoke of it in guarded terms, saying it had once been kept in a golden city by the sea, a phrase historians suspect referred to Constantinople. The cleric also hinted that the book had been removed from there under duress and was not meant to remain in the Holy Land for long. Less than a year after this entry, Acre came under renewed threat, and the trail of the book vanishes from local records. If the manuscript did pass briefly through the Crusader states, it would have been during a period of volatile alliances, making its transport to Rome or a friendly port city plausible. This would align with documented shipments of relics and manuscripts from the Levant to Italian maritime republics during the early 13th century. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa all played roles in transferring high-value ecclesiastical items westward, often under the guise of safeguarding them from conflict. From there, the Vatican's acquisition could have been arranged quietly, bypassing public inventories. Such a route would explain how the book entered papal possession without leaving a clear trail in official Byzantine or Latin chronicles. The merchant's description, though brief, preserves one of the few medieval phrases, implying the manuscript is more than ink and parchment. The suggestion that it could whisper raises questions about whether its strange perceptual effects were already known to those tasked with guarding it, centuries before modern observers documented the same phenomena. If the manuscript's strange qualities were known in the medieval period, they may have contributed to its classification among dangerous or prohibited works. The Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorum, first issued in 1559, listed texts considered heretical or morally corrupting. Yet some manuscripts were excluded from the index altogether. Instead, they were placed in a separate category, sometimes referred to in internal correspondence as libri custodiendi books, to be guarded. These works were not to be destroyed, as they might contain knowledge deemed necessary for certain theological or political purposes, but neither were they to be accessible to ordinary scholars. Surviving fragments of Vatican inventory notes from the late 16th century mention one Codex Nigellus, the Black Codex stored under the authority of the Master of the Sacred Palace, the papal office responsible for censorship. The notation includes a symbol resembling a closed eye, used in several other entries linked to esoteric or alchemical materials. While this inventory does not describe the contents, its placement alongside banned grimoires and apocryphal gospels suggests the book was already regarded as potentially subversive. The Council of Trent had only recently concluded, and the Church was in the process of consolidating doctrine against Protestant challenges. In that climate, a manuscript containing an unknown language, diagrams inconsistent with Christian cosmology, and a history tied to non-Christian origins would have been seen as both a risk and a resource. To control such a text was to control the possibility of alternative narratives about creation, history, and divine order. If the Codex Nigellus of these inventories is indeed the same manuscript locked today in the sub-reliquary, then its guardianship spans at least 4 centuries under direct papal oversight, surviving reforms, schisms, and wars without ever re-entering the public record. Throughout the 17th century, Europe saw an intense fascination with Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, and the search for ancient wisdom believed to predate both Judaism and Christianity. Private collections of nobles and cardinals often contained forbidden works, sometimes obtained through discreet exchanges with agents in the Ottoman Empire or North Africa. In 1623, the year Pope Gregory XV established the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, a letter from a Jesuit missionary in Cairo reached Rome. The letter, preserved only in partial transcription, refers to a codex without peer, said to draw the reader into its world, as a mirror draws a face. The missionary claimed the book had passed through the hands of a Coptic scribe who refused to copy it, warning that its diagrams could shift the pillars of memory itself. By the following year, an internal Vatican ledger recorded the arrival of a sealed parcel from Egypt, addressed directly to the office of the Master of the Sacred Palace. While the description is vague, the parcel's transport was accompanied by an unusually high security detail, and it bypassed all routine cataloging. Notably, in that same period, several prominent scholars at the Collegio Romano abruptly abandoned ongoing studies of non-European cosmologies, citing a redirection of priorities in line with new instructions from the Holy See. This shift may have been influenced by the book's arrival, as its imagery and text could have contained ideas that challenged the Church's preferred chronology of world history. The missionary's mention of pillars of memory is particularly striking in light of later 20th century incidents, where exposure to the manuscript appeared to trigger vivid and unfamiliar recollections. Such continuity in descriptions across centuries strengthens the argument that the book's properties were observed and feared long before modern preservation methods brought them under stricter control. By the mid-18th century, the Enlightenment had brought new pressures on the Vatican to open portions of its archives to scholarly inquiry. While limited access was granted to certain historians and linguists, the most sensitive collections remained off-limits, guarded by tradition and by papal decree. Among these was a chamber known informally as the Stanza della Luce Spenta, the Room of the Extinguished Light. Its nickname derived from the fact that no natural illumination reached its interior, and all work within was conducted by candle or oil lamp. An 1764 memorandum by a French cleric, attached to the papal court, describes being led into this chamber to witness an inventory review. He noted that one of the archivists carefully unlocked a low cabinet, revealing a tome bound in the darkest hide, which seemed to take the firelight into itself rather than reflect it. The cleric was permitted no closer than several paces, yet reported feeling an irresistible urge to step forward, an urge he likened to the pull of a magnet on iron filings. His escort quickly closed the cabinet and steered him out of the room, admonishing him never to request a second viewing. In private notes to a colleague in Avignon, he speculated that the book was not meant for reading in the ordinary sense, but for recognition that it sought out certain people who could in some way complete it. These remarks, while speculative, are consistent with later incidents in which individuals claimed to sense the manuscript before seeing it. The stanza della luce spenta no longer appears in modern archive maps, suggesting either that it has been renamed or absorbed into the deeper vault system where the manuscript is believed to rest today. The 19th century brought political turmoil to Italy, with the Papal States shrinking under the advance of unification forces. In 1870, as Rome prepared for the entry of the Kingdom of Italy's troops, certain Vatican officials undertook emergency measures to secure the most sensitive holdings of the Apostolic Archive. Among the hastily prepared records from that period is a brief inventory titled Items to be Moved to the Lower Crypt. One entry stands out. One black codex, origin uncertain, content sealed. The list specifies that this codex was to be relocated under armed escort and placed in a stone chamber accessible only through a concealed stairwell beneath the Sala della Torre Borgia. This was no ordinary storage area, but part of a series of medieval fortifications adapted for archival use during times of siege. The relocation appears to have been successful, as no mention of the manuscript is found in reports of items lost or damaged during the subsequent occupation of Rome. Curiously, within months of this transfer, the newly formed Italian government began pressing the Vatican for access to certain archival collections as part of a wider cultural integration effort. The Holy See resisted, citing the confidential nature of its holdings, and negotiations on the matter quietly dissolved. The decision to hide the manuscript in a fortified crypt suggests that it was considered not only valuable, but potentially irreplaceable, a priority even amid the chaos of losing temporal power. The continued absence of any public acknowledgement of the Codex after this date indicates that its concealment was absolute, with knowledge of its location confined to only a handful of trusted custodians whose successors maintain that secrecy to this day. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. At the turn of the 20th century, renewed interest in ancient languages and comparative mythology began to sweep through European academia. The Vatican quietly participated in this movement by allowing certain controlled studies of obscure manuscripts, though the Black Codex remained entirely restricted. One of the few indirect references to it during this period comes from the notes of Monsignor Pietro Valenti, a linguist working within the Secretariat of State. In a private journal entry from 1903, Valenti wrote of being summoned to examine a fragmentary transcript whose source could not be disclosed. The fragment contained 6 lines of script, each composed of symbols unfamiliar to him, yet oddly rhythmic in their arrangement. Valenti observed that while the shapes bore no relation to Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or known hieroglyphics, they seemed to echo phonetic groupings found in early Sumerian prayers. His curiosity deepened when, after studying the transcript late into the night, he experienced an intense and vivid dream of a city of gleaming white stone set beside a black sea. The dream was so compelling that he recorded architectural details upon waking, only to find that they matched no known city, ancient or modern. Weeks later, he was informed that his services on the matter were no longer required, and the fragment was reclaimed by its courier. Valenti never saw it again, but in his final entry on the subject, he wrote, "If these 6 lines are a true sample, then the work from which they come is no mere text, it is a doorway, and I stood too close to his threshold." The Vatican has never confirmed the origin of the transcript, but its description aligns with the peculiarities attributed to the Codex in both older and later accounts. During the First World War, the Vatican maintained an official stance of neutrality, yet behind the scenes, it engaged in discreet exchanges of information and materials with both sides. Among the less publicized activities was the safeguarding of cultural artifacts threatened by the conflict. In 1917, a sealed wooden crate arrived in Vatican City from an undisclosed location in the eastern Mediterranean, while the shipping manifests listed it as containing archival material. An internal memorandum in the Archivum Secretum described the delivery as an item long absent, now returned to rightful custody. Some researchers believe this phrasing refers to the Black Codex, suggesting it may have spent part of the early 20th century outside the Vatican's direct possession. The memo also contains an unusual remark. The pages have not altered in our absence. This is curious, given the earlier reports of the manuscript's shifting forms under different light, raising questions about whether such changes are constant or dependent on a reader's presence. If the Codex had indeed been stored far from human interaction for years, perhaps even decades, the remark could imply that it remains inert, when untouched, a dormant instrument waiting for activation. No other documentation explains why the book might have been removed from the Vatican, or what events led to its eventual return. The fact that this transfer occurred amid the chaos of war may have been intentional, using the broader disorder as cover. After its arrival, the crate was taken directly to the deepest vaults beneath the Apostolic Palace, bypassing the standard archival intake process. Since then, no further records indicate it has left Vatican custody again, at least officially, strengthening the belief that whatever risks are associated with it are now considered too great to permit any lapse in control. By the 1930s, the Vatican had entered a period of significant reorganization under Pope Pius XI, whose interest in archaeology and ancient manuscripts was well known. Yet even his papacy maintained an unwavering policy of seclusion for the Black Codex. A rare insight into its status during this era comes from a 1934 diary entry of Father Augustin Keller, a Swiss Jesuit scholar assisting with the cataloging of Near Eastern artifacts. Keller wrote that he had been unexpectedly called to translate a brief passage from a volume of unusual character for a senior archivist. The excerpt was copied onto heavy vellum and consisted of just 4 lines, but the symbols were unlike any script Keller had encountered. He noted that the forms seemed to blur at the edges if stared at for too long, forcing him to glance away repeatedly. Within hours of completing the translation attempt, which yielded only uncertain phonetic approximations, Keller reported suffering an unshakable sense that the symbols were still arranging themselves in his mind. Over the following nights, he experienced dreams of vast halls lined with books whose pages turned on their own, whispering in voices too low to distinguish. Keller's health declined rapidly, and he was sent back to Switzerland to recover. The Vatican retained his notes, but made no official record of the translation. The episode was quietly omitted from his otherwise meticulous academic portfolio. What makes Keller's account notable is its striking similarity to both earlier and later testimonies. The sense of visual instability in the script, the intrusion of vivid dream imagery, and the lingering impression that the text maintained some presence beyond the page. If Keller's experience came from only 4 lines, the impact of confronting the entire manuscript may be far greater and potentially irreversible. The outbreak of the Second World War placed the Vatican in a precarious position, both politically and logistically. While officially neutral, it became a hub for confidential diplomatic exchanges, and the Apostolic Archive increased its security to unprecedented levels. In late 1942, a classified memorandum was circulated among a small circle of archivists titled Protocol for Nocturnal Observation of the Black Codex. The document instructed that the manuscript be exposed to natural moonlight on 3 consecutive nights, with each session timed to begin at the moment the moon reached its highest point over St. Peter's Basilica. Reports from these observations, preserved in the ciphered appendix, describe the sudden emergence of faint silver tracery across the pages. These lines connected individual characters into elaborate geometric patterns resembling both constellations and mechanical diagrams. In one session, a full-page arrangement was recorded, resembling a star map overlaid with the structure of an astrolabe. Attempts to photograph the phenomenon failed. The tracery did not appear on film, leaving only hand-drawn reproductions by the attending archivists. After the 3rd night, the Codex was returned to its vault, and no further nocturnal experiments were authorized for decades. The reasons for halting the observations are unclear, though one archivist later hinted that a senior official experienced disorientation and memory gaps following the final session. This is the first documented case in which the manuscript appears to have produced an effect under controlled, repeated conditions, rather than in isolated incidents. The precision of the patterns and their correlation with astronomical configurations suggest the book's contents may respond to celestial alignment, as though key to cycles beyond human reckoning. Such a property would make it less a static text and more an instrument, one whose full function might only reveal itself at the right moment in the sky's turning. In the aftermath of the war, the Vatican began quietly reviewing the survival and condition of its most sensitive holdings. Among the post-war notes from 1946 is a brief entry marked Riservatissimo, most restricted, which states simply, Codex intact, no change since Moonface trial. Yet alongside this, a separate and unsigned report written on personal stationery rather than official archive paper tells a different story. The anonymous author claims that, while the book's physical condition was unchanged, several lines of text on one page had subtly altered since their last inspection. The change was not in the language itself, which remained unreadable, but in the spacing and curvature of the symbols, as if the writing had been rewritten in the same hand but with a different intent. The author likened it to a familiar face that suddenly appears to be wearing a different expression. Even more troubling was the observation that the altered lines now mirrored a passage copied decades earlier by Monsignor Pietro Valenti in 1903, when he was shown a mysterious fragment of unknown origin. This correlation was never acknowledged in any official Vatican records, suggesting that those aware of it feared the implications. If the Codex could modify its own arrangement over time, seemingly in relation to past human interaction, it would imply a reactive quality, as though it retained memory of prior readers and incorporated their encounters into itself. This would transform it from a passive artifact into something closer to a participant in its own preservation, choosing when and how to reveal itself. In the context of a library where millions of pages remain static for centuries, the possibility of a manuscript that changes in response to human contact presents both a scholarly enigma and a theological risk. By the 1960s, the Second Vatican Council brought a wave of modernization to the Church, including discussions about transparency in certain areas of scholarship. Yet the Black Codex remained an exception, excluded from any consideration for wider access. In 1965, a Jesuit astronomer working with the Vatican Observatory was permitted a brief supervised viewing, under the pretext that his expertise in celestial mapping might clarify the manuscript's recurring star-like diagrams. His later private notes, preserved in his family's estate after his death, describe the unsettling experience in detail. He observed that some constellations embedded in the marginal designs did not match any current star patterns, but could be reconstructed by rewinding precession the slow shift of the Earth's axis by thousands of years. When he did so, several diagrams aligned precisely with the night sky, as it would have appeared over the eastern Mediterranean around 500 BCE, an era far predating any known system of written language. This realization left him deeply unsettled, especially when he noticed a second set of diagrams that did not match Earth's sky at all. These were not random points but coherent patterns, suggesting observation from a vantage point far from our planet. His audience with the manuscript was limited to less than an hour, and afterward he was never invited back. In his final remarks on the matter, he warned that the book's diagrams might represent positions in both time and space beyond our accepted history. This statement, though quietly dismissed in official channels, added a new dimension to the Codex's mystery, that it could encode astronomical knowledge from before civilization as we know it, and perhaps from locations humanity has never reached. In 1978, during the brief papacy of John Paul I, a minor structural renovation in one of the Vatican's lesser-known sublevels inadvertently exposed an older wall behind a storage alcove. Within this wall was a sealed niche containing a small iron-bound coffer. The work crew, unaware of the content's significance, delivered it to the archivists on duty. Inside was a bundle of vellum sheets wrapped in silk, so faded it was nearly gray. The sheets contained sketches unmistakably matching several of the Codex's more intricate page layouts, including marginal diagrams never before documented in official inventories. Alongside the sketches was a slim notebook written in 18th century Italian, its author identifying himself only as Father Alves. He claimed to have been part of a shadow office within the Vatican, whose sole task was to monitor the Codex's state over decades and record any irregularities. The notebook describes subtle changes in the manuscript's page numbering, as though folios had been added or removed without altering the binding. It also mentions that certain diagrams would fade entirely on some visits, only to reappear years later with slight variations. Most striking is a passage in which Father Alves recounts being told by his predecessor that the book keeps its own calendar, showing different content depending on cycles known only to itself. The rediscovery of this notebook and the vellum sketches was quickly classified, and the coffer was moved into the same vault as the Codex. Whether the diagrams within the sketches still match the current state of the manuscript is unknown, as no contemporary comparison has been made public. The existence of a centuries-old internal monitoring group suggests that the Vatican has long recognized and quietly studied the Codex's mutable nature. The election of John Paul II in late 1978 brought a renewed emphasis on interfaith dialogue and historical research. Yet the Black Codex remained firmly under lock and key. In 1983, an unusual request reached the Vatican from a team of linguists at the University of Warsaw, who were compiling an atlas of undeciphered scripts. They asked for permission to study a photographed sample of the Codex's writing, claiming it might share characteristics with symbols found on the Phaistos disk and certain Proto-Elamite tablets. The Vatican denied the request outright, but an internal communication shows that a partial transcript of 12 lines was quietly circulated among 3 trusted consultants. One of these, a Benedictine paleographer, noted that while the symbols bore no direct resemblance to any known writing system, they did display consistent internal rules, spacing, repetition, and mirroring that implied a deliberate grammar. He also observed that the script seemed to contain embedded visual cues, tiny variations in line thickness, forming secondary shapes when viewed from an angle. This finding is significant because it mirrors techniques used in certain medieval cipher manuscripts, where hidden images could guide decoding. Another consultant, a cognitive scientist, theorized that the symbols might be designed to engage the brain's pattern recognition processes in a way that bypassed conscious language comprehension, triggering responses in deeper cognitive layers. If accurate, this could explain the recurrent reports of dreams, déjà vu, and altered perception among those exposed to even small portions of the text. Ultimately, the sample was returned to the vault without further analysis, and all notes were archived under restricted classification. The brief experiment, though limited, reinforced the Vatican's long-standing suspicion that the Codex's content was not merely strange, but engineered to interact directly with the human mind in ways modern science has yet to understand. In the mid-1990s, the Codex resurfaced in internal discussions following an unusual incident involving a visiting cardinal from South America. He had been granted a rare tour of the Vatican's most secure archive levels as an honor during his elevation to the College of Cardinals. The tour was meant to be ceremonial, with no physical contact allowed. However, upon entering the chamber where the Codex was stored, the cardinal paused abruptly and stared toward the stand on which it rested. Witnesses later recounted that he whispered something in a language no one recognized, though the tone was described as both reverent and distressed. When asked what he had said, he reportedly claimed he did not remember speaking at all. Later that evening, the cardinal confided to a close aide that the sight of the manuscript had brought back a memory of a place he had never visited, a vast, terraced city carved into a cliff face where a crowd gathered in silence around a black stone altar. He insisted the memory was not a dream but as vivid as any real experience. The aide, disturbed by the account, advised him not to mention it to Vatican officials. Within a week, the cardinal cut short his visit and returned to his diocese, declining further invitations to Rome. Though this event was never entered into official records, several archivists involved in the tour quietly lobbied for even stricter access protocols afterward. Their reasoning was that if the Codex could evoke such powerful and specific imagery in someone without prior exposure, then its influence might not be limited by language, culture, or personal history. Instead, it might operate on a more universal level of perception, a quality that would make it both more dangerous and more difficult to guard against. By the early 2000s, advancements in digital imaging prompted some within the Vatican to propose non-invasive scanning of the Black Codex. The goal was to create a high-resolution, multispectral record that could be studied without further handling of the manuscript. In 2003, a controlled trial was approved, using a prototype scanner capable of capturing details beyond the visible spectrum. The project lasted only 1 day. According to a technical summary marked Confidenziale, the scans produced anomalies that baffled the imaging team. In the ultraviolet range, certain pages displayed intricate networks of lines and symbols entirely absent in normal light. These hidden layers appear to shift slightly between successive scans, taken minutes apart, as though the images were in motion. In the infrared range, other pages showed faint impressions of shapes resembling human faces, some partially obscured by the main text. Attempts to process the data led to repeated system crashes, and in one case, the corruption of an entire storage drive. The equipment manufacturer could not explain the failures, noting that no mechanical faults were present. After a private review by senior archivists, the project was abruptly terminated, and all digital files were ordered erased. The scanner itself was dismantled and returned to the manufacturer without explanation. One technician later claimed that during the final session, he experienced a sensation of being observed from the page, an impression so unsettling that he refused further work in the archive. This aborted attempt at digitization reinforced a growing internal belief. The Codex might not just contain mutable information, but could actively resist reproduction, as if its preservation depended on remaining beyond the reach of modern duplication. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. In 2009, the Codex was mentioned again in a restricted seminar for newly appointed curators within the Apostolic Archive. The purpose of the briefing was to familiarize them with items classified as Custodia Perpetua artifacts, requiring indefinite and unbroken guardianship. According to one attendee's later private recollection, the session devoted to the Codex was brief but unnervingly direct. The speaker, a senior archivist with decades of service, warned that the manuscript was not to be approached casually, nor even regarded for long. He recounted an incident from the previous year in which a junior archivist, tasked only with dusting nearby shelves, accidentally glanced at an open page during a supervised inspection. Within hours, the archivist complained of a persistent, low-frequency hum in his ears, accompanied by fleeting images of unknown landscapes. These images became more elaborate over the next 2 days, eventually forming what he described as a continuous scene, a moonlit shoreline under a sky filled with stars unfamiliar to Earth. The archivist was placed on leave, and the images reportedly ceased after several weeks away from the Vatican. What unsettled the seminar attendees most was the archivist's final statement before leaving, that during the visions, he had been aware of someone standing just out of sight, as if waiting for him to notice. The senior archivist concluded the account by stating that the Codex was never to be handled by anyone without explicit written authorization from the Secretariat of State, and even then only under the strictest protocols. His tone, according to the attendee, carried less the authority of policy and more the gravity of personal experience, as though the warning came not only from duty, but from genuine caution, born of what he had seen. In 2013, the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI and the transition to Pope Francis brought renewed media attention to the Vatican's inner workings. While the Codex was never mentioned publicly, its name surfaced in an internal security audit conducted shortly after the change in leadership. The audit's purpose was to ensure that all Custodia Perpetua artifacts were accounted for during the administrative shift. A classified addendum to the audit, later described by an anonymous source, noted that the Codex had undergone unexplained folio variants since its last recorded inspection. Specifically, the number of bound pages appeared to have increased by 2, despite no evidence of tampering with the binding. The new folios contained the same indecipherable script, but also featured diagrams unlike anything previously documented. Sprawling, web-like structures of interlocking circles and lines, some faintly shaded as if depicting layers or depth. One diagram was compared by the reviewing archivist to a city seen from above, while another resembled a complex astronomical chart. No one could account for when or how these pages had appeared, and the possibility that they had always been present but unnoticed was considered unlikely due to the meticulous nature of earlier cataloging. The addendum recommended sealing the Codex for an indefinite period with no further inspections scheduled unless ordered directly by the Pope. This recommendation was approved without amendment, effectively placing the manuscript into a deeper layer of seclusion than it had endured in decades. That the Codex could seemingly expand itself posed a new and troubling dimension to its mystery, suggesting that it was not simply mutable in appearance, but capable of physically altering its form. By 2017, whispers about the Codex had reached a small circle of academic researchers outside the Vatican, largely through indirect leaks from former employees. That year, a retired conservator who had once worked in the Apostolic Archive gave a discreet interview to an Italian historian. Without naming the Codex directly, he spoke of a book that changes its own skin. When pressed, he elaborated that this meant the texture and even the scent of the pages would differ between encounters, sometimes feeling like soft vellum, other times coarse and dry, as though made from an entirely different material. He claimed to have seen the same page appear yellowed and brittle during one visit, only to find it snow-white and supple on another, with no visible repairs or replacements in between. The historian initially dismissed the account as embellishment, until the conservator mentioned a specific diagram he had once traced by hand for preservation notes, a spiral lattice that, when followed with the eye, seemed to induce a sensation of movement in the room itself. This detail matched an unpublished description in an internal Vatican report from decades earlier, which the historian later confirmed through his own sources. If the conservator's testimony was truthful, it implies that the Codex's variability extends beyond what can be seen into the tactile and even olfactory senses, making it nearly impossible to document in a consistent manner. Such mutability would also explain the Vatican's strict prohibition against prolonged handling, as even the act of touching it might introduce changes or trigger unpredictable reactions. The interview was never published in full, and the historian later remarked that he had been strongly encouraged to abandon further inquiries. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic forced closures of many Vatican offices, the Apostolic Archive operated at minimal capacity. Only essential staff were permitted in the deeper vaults, and even then under strict time limits. During this period, an archivist assigned to environmental monitoring equipment in the Codex's storage chamber recorded an anomaly. The temperature and humidity sensors, calibrated to remain stable for long-term preservation, logged a sudden drop of several degrees Celsius over a span of less than 2 minutes, followed by a return to normal. This fluctuation occurred in the middle of the night, when no personnel were present and the climate control systems registered no faults. Curious, the archivist checked the adjacent motion sensors. Though they should have been inactive, the log showed 3 distinct readings within the Codex's immediate vicinity, each lasting only a few seconds. There were no corresponding camera recordings. The Vault's security policy prohibits visual surveillance of certain Custodia Perpetua items to avoid potential unauthorized observation. The archivist noted the anomaly in his report but added a personal comment that upon entering the room the following morning, he found the air faintly scented with something like burnt resin, a smell he had never encountered there before. The scent lingered for several hours and was detected by 2 other staff members, neither of whom could explain it. While no one could link the environmental event directly to the Codex, the incident deepened existing concerns about its ability to affect its surroundings without human interaction. It also reignited quiet speculation among archivists that the book might be sensitive to periods of human absence, behaving differently when unobserved. In early 2022, a newly appointed assistant archivist was tasked with updating the Codex's protective casing, a custom enclosure designed to stabilize temperature and humidity around the manuscript. The assignment was routine, but the archivist later recounted in a confidential interview that upon opening the case, he noticed faint markings on the inner surface of the lid. These were not scratches or stains, but deliberate etchings resembling the Codex's own script, though cruder and less precise. They appeared to have been made with a sharp instrument, yet the archivist was told that the lid's interior had never been altered since its manufacture decades earlier. The markings were photographed and compared to past documented samples of the Codex's writing, revealing partial matches to symbols from pages not currently visible in its binding. This raised the disturbing possibility that the etchings recorded content that had either been removed from the manuscript or had not yet appeared within it. The archivist also noted that while he worked, he felt a faint static-like tingling in his fingertips when handling the case, even though it contained no electrical components. When he mentioned this sensation to his supervisor, he was advised to finish the task quickly and avoid unnecessary attention to the markings. Within a week, the inner lid was replaced entirely, and the original was relocated to a separate vault without explanation. The incident was never entered into the main maintenance log, but the archivist quietly made a copy of the photographs before leaving the Vatican months later. Whether those images still exist outside official control remains unknown. But if genuine, they suggest that the Codex's influence might extend beyond its own pages, imprinting fragments of itself onto nearby objects over time. Later, in 2022, a rare and unpublicized inspection of the Black Codex was authorized for a small group of senior archivists. The stated purpose was to verify its condition after a series of minor seismic tremors had affected parts of Rome earlier that month. The vault was opened under controlled conditions, with each archivist assigned a specific role, one to handle environmental readings, one to document page order, and one to verify the state of the binding. According to a private account from one participant, the inspection began without incident until the manuscript was opened to roughly its midpoint. At that moment, several attendees reported hearing what they described as a low, sustained note, similar to the sound of wind passing through a narrow opening. The noise was not recorded by the room's environmental microphones, but it was heard clearly enough by all present to cause a pause in the procedure. One archivist described feeling the sound in his chest more than in his ears, as though it were resonating internally. When the page was turned, the sound ceased instantly, and no one attempted to recreate the conditions that had triggered it. The archivist concluded the inspection and sealed the codex again, though the incident was not included in the formal condition report. In private discussion afterward, one of the attendees suggested that the sound might have been a natural resonance caused by the vault's architecture or the positioning of the pages. But even he admitted the sensation had been unlike any acoustic phenomenon he had experienced before. The others refused to speculate, preferring to treat the occurrence as an anomaly, best left unexamined. In early 2023, the Codex became the focus of an internal theological review prompted by growing concern over the nature of its content. A small committee of Vatican scholars, including experts in scripture, ancient languages, and canon law, convened in a secure chamber to discuss whether the manuscript's continued preservation was justified. According to a source familiar with the proceedings, the debate centered on one central question: was the Codex a historical artifact to be studied, or a potentially harmful object whose influence outweighed its value? During the meeting, one linguist presented a previously undocumented observation that certain sequences of symbols in the manuscript, repeated in intervals matching the biblical numerology of 7 and 40, numbers traditionally associated with cycles of trial and transformation. Theologians on the panel argued that such precise recurrence could imply intentional design, perhaps for liturgical or ritual use. Others countered that this might be a coincidence or a natural artifact of the unknown language. Tensions rose when a canon lawyer suggested the Codex could fall under the category of res periculose, items considered inherently dangerous to the faithful, which under church authority could be permanently sealed or even destroyed. The room reportedly fell silent at the mention of destruction, and no consensus was reached. The meeting concluded with a recommendation to maintain the Codex in its current state of seclusion, pending further discernment. Yet, the fact that such a discussion occurred at all after centuries of strict silence suggests a shift in the Vatican's internal attitude. For the first time in living memory, there was acknowledgement not just of the Codex's danger, but of the possibility that the Church might one day decide to end its guardianship entirely. By mid-2023, a controlled humidity recalibration was scheduled for the vault, where the Codex is stored, a standard preservation measure repeated every few years. The procedure required the manuscript to be temporarily relocated to an adjacent secure room. 2 preservation technicians, both with prior clearance, oversaw the move under the supervision of a senior archivist. The transfer took less than 10 minutes, yet both technicians later reported experiencing an identical and highly unusual sensation during the process. Each described the moment of lifting the Codex still closed and inside its protective casing as accompanied by an abrupt awareness of being in a much larger space than the room they occupied. One likened it to standing in an open-air courtyard at night, able to feel the vastness rather than see it. The sensation faded immediately upon setting the case down in the new room. Neither spoke of the experience until days later, when casual conversation revealed the similarity of their impressions. The senior archivist, when told, responded only by reminding them that incidental perceptions were to be disregarded and that the Codex was never to be anthropomorphized or attributed with agency. However, private notes made by one of the technicians speculate that the sensation could have been triggered by the Codex's removal from its usual vault. perhaps altering some unseen equilibrium between the manuscript and its surroundings. The fact that two individuals experienced the same phenomenon simultaneously raises questions about whether the book's influence can extend even when fully enclosed, and whether the vault itself plays a role in containing more than just its physical presence. In late 2023, an unplanned power outage affected several sublevels of the Apostolic Archive, including the section where the Codex is kept. The backup generators activated within seconds, but for a brief interval, the vault was lit only by the faint glow of emergency phosphorescent strips along the floor. When the lights returned, the on-duty archivist, the only person present at the time, reported seeing the Codex's protective case lightly fogged on the inside, as though from sudden condensation. This was unusual, as the case is sealed and climate stabilized to prevent such fluctuations. He claimed the fog began to clear in uneven streaks, forming patterns that briefly resembled handwriting before dissipating entirely. The archivist attempted to note the shapes, but later admitted he could recall only fragments, most of which did not match any known alphabet. Security logs show no environmental disturbance during the blackout, and the climate sensors inside the case recorded no measurable change. When the incident was reported to his superior, the archivist was reminded of the standing policy that subjective visual impressions during vault duty were not to be entered into official records. Nonetheless, he confided to a colleague that the fleeting shapes seemed arranged in vertical columns, similar to inscriptions carved on stone monuments rather than written on parchment. The detail is intriguing, as it aligns with earlier descriptions of certain diagrams in the Codex that appear architectural in nature. Whether the fogging was a natural reaction to the brief power loss, or another manifestation of the manuscript's unpredictable behavior remains unresolved, but the archivist later admitted privately that the experience left him reluctant to work in the vault alone. Early in 2024, the Vatican quietly invited a physicist specializing in rare material analysis to consult on the Codex's preservation case. His task was to determine whether the container's composition could be further improved to shield the manuscript from environmental variables. The physicist was not permitted to open the case or see the book directly. Instead, he conducted spectrographic scans of the exterior. According to a source close to the consultation, the readings produced a faint but measurable emission of electromagnetic activity centered in the lower portion of the case. The frequency was irregular, falling outside common environmental noise patterns and showing no correlation to nearby equipment. When the physicist presented his findings, he was told the anomaly was known and not relevant to his assignment. Off the record, he expressed bafflement that an inert object, especially one entirely enclosed, could produce such readings. He also noted a peculiar side effect during his work, a recurring static charge on his fingertips, which persisted even when he moved well away from the vault. This sensation lasted for several hours after he left Vatican City. Though the data from his scans was retained by the archive, the official summary omitted any mention of the emission. The omission was deliberate, as internal policy discourages framing the Codex in terms that could suggest it possesses active or reactive properties. Yet the physicist's experience quietly circulated among a few trusted staff, adding to the growing body of unofficial accounts that the manuscript's presence exerts effects detectable not only to human perception, but also to sensitive instruments' effects that are never allowed to be publicly acknowledged. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. subscribe. By mid-2024, a scheduled deep inspection of the Codex binding was carried out by one of the Vatican's most experienced conservation teams. The purpose was to check for any signs of physical stress, insect activity, or environmental wear. The team worked under controlled lighting, using magnification lenses to examine every stitch and seam without disturbing the pages themselves. During the inspection, the lead conservator observed an irregularity in the thread used for part of the binding, a section where the fibers appear newer and tighter than the rest, as if repaired or replaced at some point in the past century. What made this remarkable was the absence of any archival record noting such a repair. More curious still, embedded within the fibers were minute flecks of a metallic substance that shimmered faintly under magnification. These flecks were non-magnetic and could not be identified without destructive sampling, which was not permitted. The conservator described the metallic particles as forming no clear pattern yet seeming oddly deliberate in their distribution, almost like a residue rather than an accidental inclusion. While no one on the team openly speculated about their origin, one assistant privately suggested they could be remnants of an earlier clasp or fastening mechanism that had long since been removed. If so, the implication is that the Codex might once have been locked shut, a feature not mentioned in any surviving historical accounts. The idea that it may have been intentionally secured in the past and later altered to allow access raises questions about whether its current binding reflects its original form at all, or whether changes made over the centuries have already altered whatever it was meant to contain or conceal. In late 2024, a controlled lighting recalibration was conducted in the Codex's vault, part of a broader program to replace older illumination systems with low-heat, full-spectrum LEDs. The project required a brief period in which the manuscript was exposed to varying wavelengths to test potential effects on preservation. According to a confidential report, most of the testing yielded predictable results, except during the application of a narrow band in the violet range. Under this light, several pages near the front of the Codex displayed faint overlaid designs not visible in any other spectrum. These designs were not text, but appeared to be topographical in nature, with ridges, depressions, and what looked like water channels. One observer likened the imagery to an ancient map, though the landforms did not correspond to any known region on Earth. Even more perplexing, the designs shifted subtly during the 2 minutes they remained visible, as if revealing different perspectives or times. The supervising archivist, aware of the potential implications, ordered the violet spectrum test halted immediately and instructed that no photographic records be made. Instead, the observers were asked to sketch what they saw from memory, but no two drawings matched exactly. The incident was classified as light response anomaly and logged without further comment. Privately, one technician suggested that if the Codex did contain maps, they might not be fixed to a single place, or era instead. They could represent locations inaccessible to conventional geography. Whether those locations are purely symbolic or point to actual sites remains unknown, but the reluctance to document the phenomena suggests that even the possibility of the latter is considered too sensitive to circulate within official channels. In early 2025, a discreet request reached the Apostolic Archive from a senior cleric stationed in the Middle East. He claimed to have encountered stone carvings in a remote desert monastery that bore a striking resemblance to symbols he had once glimpsed in the Codex decades earlier, during his time as a theology student in Rome. Intrigued, The archive authorized a limited comparative review using a tightly controlled selection of photographed folios images, normally restricted to the highest level of clearance. The comparison revealed undeniable similarities in at least a dozen symbols, though the stone carvings were far cruder, as if copied from memory or replicated without full understanding of their meaning. The carvings appeared weathered, suggesting great age, and were partially buried under layers of sand and debris. What unsettled the reviewing archivists most was the discovery that several of the matching symbols from the Codex had been among those reported to shift or alter in previous decades. This raised an uncomfortable possibility that the manuscript's mutable content might still correspond to physical inscriptions in the outside world, or that both derive from a shared source predating recorded history. The findings were immediately classified, and the photographs from the monastery were transferred to the same vault as the Codex. No expedition was organized to further investigate the site, perhaps out of caution that publicity could draw unwanted attention. Yet among those involved in the review, a quiet consensus formed. Whatever the Codex represents, it is not an isolated artifact of the Vatican's collection. It may be part of a far wider and older network of knowledge, one that has left traces scattered in places long abandoned and forgotten. By the spring of 2025, discussions within the Vatican about the Codex had taken on an unusually urgent tone. While official records continue to describe it in strictly archival terms, several senior figures began holding private meetings to address the containment question, whether the manuscript's current storage conditions were truly sufficient. This shift was prompted by an incident involving a visiting liturgical historian who was granted access to view selected high-resolution photographs of the Codex for research on medieval symbology. The historian later reported an intense and unshakable dream the same night, in which he walked through an endless colonnade beneath a sky without sun or moon. At the far end of the colonnade stood a black lectern supporting an open book, its pages turning without wind. Upon waking, he realized the symbols in his dream matched those he had studied in the photographs, even though he had not consciously memorized them. Disturbed, he withdrew from the project and sent a formal request for his notes to be destroyed. Word of his account reached the archivists, and though no official link was made, it reinforced the concern that even indirect exposure through reproductions rather than the physical manuscript might be enough to produce cognitive effects. In the wake of this, a proposal was circulated to permanently cease all photographic reproduction of the Codex, regardless of clearance level. The proposal's language hinted at a quiet recognition that the manuscript's influence might extend through image alone, making it far more difficult to control than previously acknowledged. Whether the proposal will be enacted remains uncertain, but the debate marks a significant turn. The problem may no longer be limited to guarding the book itself, but containing the idea of it. In mid-2025, during a scheduled environmental recalibration in the Codex's vault, an unexpected reading was logged by the chamber's acoustic sensors. Normally, these devices register only the faint hum of ventilation systems and the occasional creak of settling masonry. Yet for approximately 40 seconds, they recorded a low, rhythmic pulse at intervals of just under 2 seconds. The sound was so faint that it was nearly indistinguishable from background noise, but spectral analysis revealed it to be structured a consistent waveform rather than random vibration. The origin could not be traced to any machinery in the building, and the frequency did not match seismic activity in the region. One archivist who reviewed the data privately remarked that the rhythm was uncomfortably close to a slow human heartbeat. Although no one present in the vault reported hearing anything at the time, the anomaly was quietly added to a restricted log that compiles unexplained environmental events connected to the Codex. Within that same week, the manuscript was inspected to rule out physical damage, and nothing unusual was found. Still, the timing of the incident, occurring while technicians were making slight adjustments to airflow and temperature, raised the question of whether changes in the surrounding environment could provoke subtle responses from the manuscript itself. Officially, the matter was closed with no further investigation. But among a small circle of archivists, the acoustic reading became one more data point in a long, unofficial record of phenomena suggesting the Codex is not entirely inert. The reluctance to even discuss such implications remains as strong as ever, perhaps because acknowledging them would mean accepting that preservation may not be the only form of containment required. Late in 2025, the Vatican received a sealed diplomatic pouch from a mission in North Africa containing artifacts recovered during the stabilization of an ancient coastal ruin. Among them was a fragment of carved basalt, no larger than a man's hand, bearing intricate markings. A cultural liaison who reviewed the find noted that several of the carvings bore a striking resemblance to symbols from the Black Codex, specifically ones recorded in the earliest surviving sketches of the manuscript from the 17th century. The fragment's surface showed signs of intense heat, as if it had once been part of a structure exposed to fire or volcanic activity. When the piece was brought to the Apostolic Archive for comparison, it was examined by a pair of archivists who had previously handled the Codex. Both reported the unsettling impression that the symbols on the stone appeared slightly more defined after prolonged observation, though they dismissed this as a trick of the eye. The basalt fragment was ultimately classified and placed in a small containment drawer within the same deep vault as the Codex, with the reasoning that objects sharing its symbols should be kept in close proximity. No official explanation was given for this decision, though it quietly fueled speculation that the Vatican believes such items may be linked in ways beyond the visual, perhaps sharing a common origin, or even influencing one another when brought together. The archaeologists who had originally uncovered the ruin were not informed of the fragment's final destination, and the site itself was left unexcavated. For those inside the archive, it was yet another reminder that the Codex's reach extends far beyond the walls that contain it. In the closing months of 2025, a senior Vatican archivist nearing retirement decided to record an oral history of his decades in the Apostolic Archive. Intended as a personal memoir for his family, the account was never meant for official circulation. In one section, he described a moment early in his career when he was unexpectedly called to assist during an unscheduled inspection of the Black Codex. The request came late in the evening, and he recalled feeling both honored and uneasy. As he stood in the dimly lit vault while senior staff examined the manuscript, he found his gaze drawn to a single page filled with tightly packed symbols and faint geometric patterns. He swore that, for a few seconds, the page seemed to shift in perspective, as though he were looking down into a three-dimensional space rather than at a flat surface. The sensation was brief but so vivid that he instinctively stepped back. No one else in the room appeared to notice, and he chose not to mention it at the time. Decades later, recounting the memory for his recording, he admitted that the moment had never left him, and that in quiet hours he sometimes felt as if that page was still waiting for him to look at it again. The memoir, stored on a private device, was eventually found by a family member after his death and quietly turned over to the church. It is now kept in the same restricted collection as the Codex itself, sealed under the justification that even personal impressions of the manuscript constitute sensitive material. The archivist's words remain unheard by the public, his experience folded into the manuscript's long history of encounters that leave no tangible evidence, only the lingering certainty of having seen something impossible. In January 2026, the Vatican quietly commissioned a material scientist with expertise in anomalous aging patterns to conduct a non-invasive examination of the Codex cover. Using portable spectroscopy equipment, the scientists scanned the leather binding under supervision, expecting to find the usual mix of organic and mineral residues common to centuries-old manuscripts. Instead, the analysis returned an irregular profile. The leather showed chemical signatures consistent with animal hide, yet certain portions registered as having no detectable organic markers at all, behaving spectrally more like treated stone than skin. These areas formed no consistent pattern across the binding but appeared in thin, irregular patches, as if the cover itself had been gradually transformed in places over time. When asked for an explanation, the scientist admitted he could not account for the results without destructive sampling, which was strictly forbidden. The supervising archivist suggested the anomalies might be due to ancient preservation treatments that had since degraded, though he did not seem convinced by his own reasoning. Privately, the scientist later confided to a colleague that during the scans, he felt an almost imperceptible vibration through the equipment's hand grip whenever the sensor passed over the inorganic patches. He could not replicate a sensation in any other setting, and his official report made no mention of it. The findings were sealed along with the scan data, accessible only to the most senior archive staff. To the few aware of the incident, the idea that the Codex's physical material might be slowly altering on a molecular level was deeply troubling. It suggested that the manuscript is not merely mutable in its content, but in its very substance, a quality that might make preservation, in the traditional sense, an entirely different challenge than the Church has ever faced. In March 2026, a rare joint meeting was convened between archivists of the Apostolic Archive and representatives from the Vatican Observatory. While the official agenda listed it as a discussion on shared preservation protocols, several attendees later admitted the real purpose was to review an unusual finding. A senior astronomer had noticed that one of the diagrams in the Codex, preserved only in an early 20th century sketch, bore an uncanny resemblance to a current astronomical observation, a dense cluster of stars recently imaged by space-based instruments. The similarity was not exact, but the arrangement of the brightest points and the curving lines connecting them mirrored the Codex drawing in a way that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. The astronomer stressed that this particular star cluster, located thousands of light years from Earth, had only been visible in such detail thanks to modern infrared imaging, making it impossible for a medieval or Renaissance artist to have depicted it accurately. The discussion quickly shifted to whether the diagram might represent something other than a star field, perhaps a symbolic pattern later echoed in the cosmos, but no consensus was reached. Ultimately, the observatory representatives were instructed to treat the matter as confidential and to refrain from making further comparisons without authorization. For the archivists present, the meeting reinforced a persistent undercurrent in the Codex's history. that its contents occasionally align with information unknown at the time of their recording. Whether this alignment is evidence of extraordinary foresight, coincidence, or something entirely beyond current understanding remains the unspoken question. The sketch in question was returned to its vault, its connection to the modern star cluster noted only in an internal memorandum marked for restricted circulation. By late 2026, the Codex's official status within the Apostolic Archive shifted quietly but significantly. For centuries, it had been classified as Custodia Perpetua, an artifact requiring indefinite preservation. Now, without public notice, it was redesignated under a new internal category that combined archival with security oversight, a classification typically reserved for objects considered active risks. This change followed an incident during a routine integrity check in which the supervising archivist reported a brief but intense sensation of vertigo upon opening the case. He described the feeling as if the floor beneath him had dropped several inches, though instruments in the room recorded no structural movement. Two assistants present later admitted to experiencing a similar momentary imbalance, accompanied by an odd shift in peripheral vision, as though the edges of the room had drawn closer. While the archivist recovered quickly, the event was considered serious enough to trigger an immediate review of the vault's physical containment measures. New protocols were implemented, including a limit on the duration the Codex can be exposed during any handling session, and a requirement that a minimum of 3 authorized staff be present at all times. The incident also prompted a renewed internal debate over whether the manuscript should remain accessible even at the highest clearance level. In the final confidential report, the archivist's words were preserved without alteration. It is not that the book moves. It is that the space around it seems to remember another shape, and for a moment tries to return to it. With this, the Codex entered a new phase of its guarded existence, its mystery intact, its danger now formally acknowledged, and its future within the Vatican more uncertain than ever. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.